Tim Don Sacha Dune Kushin Tutong Prun Derek Paul Phil Gary Tom Craig Spencer Howard Nathan Cole Vincent Rebecca Sandra Drew Brendan Felix Claudia Cassandra Drew Brendan Felix Claudia Cassandra Elliott Arthur Weston Hiroko Linda Warren Jasper Meredith Catherine Ray Owen Schraft Cooper Callie Henderson Marcus Dominic Gerald Nora Dwight Kellerman Kowalski Trent Reginald Hal Brent Callaway Fitch, Theo, Temham, Ahisuis, Gu Didung, Ret, Non Ret, Non V Fruen, Ten Chin Ten, Think Fung, X Thinkan, Toi, CEO Contrae, equals Preston Jr., Tent Toe, Preston Co Tron Crescript Gaha, Kekwi, Preston Co Transcript Gahung, Bunalden, CEO Con, CEO Cha, equals Walter, Nahang, Dehungen, Dehungeni ups P before boo, Fishmorovi ups Pia, Boomitovits Tsi, Mit Ini equals Sylvia, Lunits Fiu Chuns, Finia, Lucanod's thing. The projector was still running when my access card stopped working. I didn't notice it at first. I was too busy watching the expressions around the conference table. 14 people who had known me for 19 years, who had eaten birthday cake in the break room with me, who had asked about my daughter's soccer games every Monday morning. Not one of them said a word. My son-in-law was sitting 3 chairs down. He looked at the table. The new badge reader by the door blinked red when I pressed my card against it on the way out. Not amber, not a glitch. Red, with a long, flat beep that everyone in the hallway could hear. Someone from the facilities team was already waiting outside the conference room with a manila envelope. They planned the timing down to the minute. Inside the envelope, a termination letter, a non-disclosure agreement, and a prepaid parking validation for my car. Like they'd done me a favor. I signed nothing. I handed the envelope back to the facilities guy, a kid named something like Brandon, been there maybe 8 months, and I told him I'd be in touch through my attorney. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I didn't blame him. I walked to my car. The Junair hit me like a wall. I sat behind the wheel for maybe 4 minutes without starting the engine, and I thought about something my father told me a long time ago. He said, "The only thing a man truly owns is what he builds with his own hands." He was talking about a fence in the backyard, but it applied. Let me go back to the beginning because you need to understand what 19 years actually means. I joined Vantara Systems in 2005. It was a mid-sized B2B software company. About 200 employees, publicly traded at a modest multiple, serving regional banks, credit unions, and a handful of insurance carriers. Nothing flashy, but solid. The founder, a man I'll call the old CEO, his employees called him Mr. Behind his back, I'll just say, the founder. He built the company on a simple idea, compliance infrastructure for financial institutions that couldn't afford enterprise-level solutions. He was an engineer first. He understood what he was selling because he had spent 15 years building the thing himself before he ever hired a salesperson. I came in as a senior software architect. Within 3 years, I was leading the core systems division. Here's a thing nobody talks about when they tell startup to IPO stories, the unglamorous part. The 4-year stretch where I basically lived in server rooms, the weekends rewriting legacy authentication modules because a bank in Ohio called on a Friday afternoon saying their transaction verification was throwing errors on wire transfers. The Christmas Eve, my daughter was 11, where I drove 40 minutes to a co-location facility because a routing table had corrupted overnight and 60,000 end users couldn't access their accounts. My wife packed me dinner in a thermos. I ate it in a parking garage. By 2009, the system I had designed and rebuilt from the ground up, the fraud detection and compliance verification layer we called the Meridian Framework, was handling over $4 billion in daily transaction volume across 37 financial institutions. I held the patent. Not the company, me personally. It was structured that way deliberately. The founder had insisted on it, actually, because he understood what it meant to have your name on the thing you built. The licensing agreement was specific. Vantara held a perpetual commercial license to deploy and monetize the Meridian framework for as long as I remained an active contributor in good standing. That clause. I'll come back to that clause. By 2019, the framework had been independently valued at just over $2 billion as a standalone asset. The founder knew this. He never once tried to renegotiate the agreement or pressure me to reassign the patent. We had that kind of relationship. He'd call me on Sunday evening sometimes, not about work, about fishing, about his grandchildren, about a book he was reading. When his wife had her hip replaced, my wife sent flowers. That's the kind of company it was when he was running it. He retired in the spring of 2023. His son took over in July. I want to be fair here because I've thought about this a lot. His son, I'll call him the new CEO or just him, wasn't stupid. He had an MBA from a good school. He was organized, he wore expensive shoes, and he knew how to run a meeting. What he didn't have was any engineering background, any product intuition, or any particular interest in acquiring either of those things. What he had was a very clear idea about what the company should look like. Meaning, a leaner cost structure, a more aggressive go-to-market narrative, and a management team that would nod along with whatever he said. I was none of those things. I noticed it early. Small things at first. My division stopped being included in product roadmap discussions. Budget requests that would have been approved in a week under the founder took 3 months and came back reduced by 60%. A consultant was brought in. I think the new CEO hired him through a business school connection to modernize the tech stack. This consultant had never worked in financial compliance software in his life. He had a great slide deck, though. I remember the meeting where this consultant presented his findings. He called the Meridian framework architecturally dated and suggested replacing it with a third-party vendor solution over 18 months. He used the phrase technical debt 11 times. I counted. I asked one question. Had he reviewed the licensing agreement? He said the legal team was handling that separately. The legal team, as it turned out, was a 28-year-old associate who had been at the firm for 14 months. I went back to my office and called my attorney, not to panic, just to make sure I understood what I had. We talked for 45 minutes. By the end of the call, I was completely calm. The next 6 months were a slow erosion. Projects I'd led for a decade were quietly reassigned. My title changed in an org chart update. No conversation, just an email from HR. 3 members of my core team were laid off in a restructuring. I documented everything. Every email, every calendar invite, every org chart change, every budget denial. I backed up everything to a secure private server that had nothing to do with Vantara's infrastructure. My attorney had advised me to do that a year earlier, and I was glad I listened. I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you. I wasn't miserable during those 6 months. I was watching. There's a kind of calm that comes when you know exactly where you stand and exactly what you hold. I had the patent. I had the agreement. I had 19 years of documentation. I wasn't going anywhere until they made me go somewhere. They made their move in October. It was a Tuesday morning. I was called into a meeting described on the calendar invite as a quarterly check-in with leadership. I walked in, and there were 6 people in the room. The new CEO, 2 board members, the head of HR, the general counsel, and someone I didn't recognize who turned out to be an outside employment attorney. That's when I knew. You don't bring outside employment counsel to a quarterly check-in. The new CEO read from a prepared statement. He said the company was moving in a new strategic direction. He said my role had become redundant. He said the Meridian framework was being sunset and replaced with a modern third-party platform. He said the company was exercising its right to terminate my employment with a standard severance package. Then he said something that I'll never forget. He leaned back in his chair. He actually leaned back, like he was finishing a presentation. And he said, "The framework you built served its purpose, but this company needs to move forward, not backward." I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at the board members. One of them was staring at the table. The other one was checking his phone. I thought about the Christmas Eve in the parking garage. I thought about the 4 a.m. server alerts I had answered for a decade. I thought about my father and the fence. Then I said, "I appreciate you letting me know. Before I go, I'd like to confirm, has your legal team completed its review of the licensing agreement, specifically Section 9, Paragraph 4? The general counsel shifted in her seat. The outside employment attorney glanced at the general counsel. The new CEO smiled. It was a small, practiced smile. "Our team has reviewed all relevant documentation," he said. I nodded. I picked up my notepad. There was nothing on it, and I said, "Then I wish you all the best. You'll hear from my attorney." I walked out. The access card failed at the front lobby door this time, not just the conference room. Someone from security had to let me out. I sat in my car again. I called my wife first. She didn't say anything for a few seconds, and then she said, "Okay, come home." She's been married to me for 26 years. She knows what silence from me means. Then I called my attorney. Here's what Section 9, Paragraph 4 of the Meridian Framework Licensing Agreement actually said. In plain language, if I, the named inventor and sole patent holder, was terminated from Vantara without documented cause and without my written consent to the framework's transition to a successor system, the commercial license would enter a 72-hour revocation window. At the end of that window, if no resolution agreement had been executed, the license would automatically revert to me, and Vantara's right to deploy or monetize any system derived from the Meridian framework would be terminated. There was a second clause. If Vantara had at any point during the preceding 24 months attempted to transition or replace the framework without my documented approval, which they had via the consultants project, which I had on paper, the revocation window could be accelerated to 48 hours. My attorney had flagged both clauses in a memo he sent me 11 months earlier. 48 hours from the moment I walked out of that conference room. I want to tell you what I did in those 48 hours, because it matters for understanding what happened next. I went home. I had dinner with my wife. She made soup, the kind with barley and the smoked sausage I like. We watched something on television, though I couldn't tell you what. I slept. The next morning I went to my home office and I wrote 3 letters, one to my attorney, formally initiating the revocation process, one to the patent office, notifying them of the pending license reversion, and one to the 37 financial institutions that were running the Meridian framework on their systems. Not threatening, not dramatic, just factual. I informed them that I was the patent holder, that a licensing dispute had arisen, and that they might want to seek independent legal counsel regarding their own agreements with Vantara. That last letter was the one nobody had thought about, because here's what the new CEO and his outside employment attorney and his 28-year-old general counsel hadn't fully worked through. The Meridian framework wasn't just running inside Vantara's product. It was running on infrastructure at 37 financial institutions, banks, credit unions, insurance carriers. Those institutions had their own regulatory obligations. When they received a letter from the patent holder suggesting a licensing dispute, they had legal and fiduciary obligations to respond. 12 of them immediately contacted their own counsel. 7 suspended access to Vantara's platform pending clarification. 3, including a regional bank that processed payroll for roughly 14,000 businesses, issued formal breach of contract notifications to Vantara within the first 18 hours. I know this because my attorney began receiving calls from their attorneys almost immediately. The 48-hour mark hit on a Thursday morning at 11:14 a.m. I was sitting in my home office with a cup of coffee when my attorney called to confirm the reversion was complete. No drama, no countdown screen, just a man on the phone telling me that the license had legally reverted to my name and that he'd filed the corresponding documentation. I said, "Okay, let me know when they call." They called 4 hours later. It wasn't the new CEO who called first. It was the head of the board, a man I'd met maybe a dozen times over 19 years, always at quarterly meetings, always in a good suit. He was not in a good suit on this phone call, or at least it didn't sound like it. He sounded like someone who had just spent 4 hours in emergency meetings with outside counsel, 3 calls with institutional investors, and a very unpleasant conversation with a regulatory compliance officer at one of the banks. He asked if we could meet. I said my attorney would be in touch. 2 days later, we sat across from each other in a conference room at my attorney's office. On their side, the board chair, the new CEO, the general counsel, and 2 outside attorneys. On my side, my attorney, my wife, and me. I want to tell you about the new CEO in that room because it was different from the last time I saw him. In the termination meeting, he had been composed, practiced. He had leaned back in his chair like the meeting was a formality. In my attorney's conference room, he sat forward. His tie was slightly off-center. He didn't read from anything prepared. He spoke first. He said he wanted to find a resolution that worked for everyone. I let my attorney respond. That's what you pay attorneys for. Here is what I wanted, and what I had told my attorney to ask for. First, my name, my full name, formally added to the company's founding technology documentation, patent licensing records, and any future public filings that reference the Meridian framework. Not a footnote. The primary inventor credit, where it had always legally been, made publicly visible. Second, the consulting firm's proposal to replace the framework, scrapped entirely, documented in board minutes. Third, a research endowment of $2 million in my name, to be administered by an engineering program at the state university where I had received my degree. Not to me personally. To the program. Fourth, and this one was non-negotiable, the new CEO would resign from the CEO position. Not be fired, resign. Voluntarily, the board could replace him with an interim CEO while they conducted a real search. But he would not be running the company that his father had built on the back of technology he had called backward. The outside attorneys on their side spent about 30 minutes pushing back on the fourth item. The board chair spent another 20 minutes attempting to reframe it. The new CEO said nothing during this entire exchange. He was looking at a spot on the table. My attorney said, "My client is prepared to extend the revocation period by 72 hours to allow for deliberation. At the end of that period, if no agreement is executed, the 37 institutions currently in litigation hold will be formally notified that no resolution was reached. Several of them have indicated they are prepared to pursue independent legal action against Vantara at that point." The board chair asked for a recess. They came back 20 minutes later. The new CEO resigned effective the following Friday. I want to be honest about how that felt, because it didn't feel the way I thought it would. It wasn't triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won a game. I felt something quieter than that, like a thing that had been slightly out of alignment for a long time had finally clicked back into place. My wife squeezed my hand under the table when the board chair said they'd accepted all 4 terms. I squeezed back. We drove home and she made pasta. We ate at the kitchen table with the good plates, the ones we only use for actual occasions. Our daughter called from Portland to ask how it went, and I told her and she said, "Dad, I'm proud of you." That hit me harder than anything in the conference room. I want to say something about the employees because I saw a version of this conversation play out in my head 100 times over the prior 6 months. The people who had stayed quiet during the termination meeting. The ones who had watched the consultant dismantle my team and said nothing. I thought I'd feel something toward them. Resentment maybe, or contempt. I didn't really. Most of them were scared. That's the honest truth. When someone is in charge and they're willing to make examples, people get scared and they go quiet. I'd seen it before. I'd been guilty of it myself. Once, early in my career when I stayed quiet in a meeting where I should have spoken up, I thought about that too. There was one person who had said something actually. A woman on my team who had been with me for 11 years. I'll call her my former colleague, because that's what she is now, in the best sense. She had sent an email to the board 2 months before I was terminated, raising concerns about the framework transition and what it might mean for the company's contractual obligations. She had CC'd me on it. The board had not responded. But she had sent it. After everything settled, I made a phone call. There was an opening at a firm I consulted with. A good role, good team. She got the offer within 2 weeks. That was the most satisfying thing I did in the entire aftermath. The agreement was signed on a Wednesday. My attorney filed the formal restoration of the licensing agreement. New terms, renegotiated, substantially better, the same day. A month later, I got a letter from a program officer at the university's engineering school. They'd received the endowment. They were naming a research fellowship after me. The first cohort of fellows would be announced in the spring. I put the letter on my desk and I looked at it for a while. The founder, the old CEO, called me that evening. I don't know how he found out so quickly, but that was always his way. He knew things. He said, "I heard you took care of yourself." I said, "You built something worth taking care of." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "I should have been more careful about who I handed it to." I told him it wasn't his fault. A man loves his son. That's the most human thing there is. We talked for maybe 20 minutes about fishing, mostly about a trip he was planning to Montana, about whether steelhead or brown trout were more technical to catch. Normal things. When I hung up, I sat in my home office in the quiet. My wife was reading in the other room. The dog was asleep under my desk. The evening light came through the window at that particular angle. it gets in October, slanted in gold. I thought about what I would tell someone younger than me. Someone early in their career, good at what they do, maybe starting to feel like the thing they built belongs to someone else. Document everything. Not because you're planning something, because what you build with your hands is yours and you have an obligation to protect it. Don't do it out of anger. Don't do it out of fear. Do it the way you'd maintain anything you care about. Steadily, carefully, and for the long term. And if someone ever calls your work dated or backward and leans back in their chair like the conversation is already over, let them finish. Then ask them if they've read the agreement. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened, not the legal mechanics of it, not the board meeting or the signed agreement, but the deeper current running underneath all of it. What Alden did wasn't unusual. That's the part that took me a while to sit with. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who had been handed something he didn't understand and had decided, rather than admit that, to remove the people who made that obvious. I've watched that happen in conference rooms for 19 years. The person who knows the least is often the loudest about modernizing, restructuring, moving forward. It's a form of self-protection. It just happens to destroy things on the way out. What I did differently. And I'm not saying this with any pride, just as observation, is that I never confused being angry with being prepared. Those are two different things. I was angry, yes, when he leaned back in that chair and called what I had built backward. Something in me went very quiet and very cold, but I had spent 11 months before that moment making sure the anger had nowhere to go except into documentation, into clause review, into my attorney's carefully marked up memo sitting in a folder on my desk at home. The anger became architecture. That's the only version of it that actually does anything. I think about Sylvia a lot. She sent that email to the board 2 months before my termination, raised the concern, CC'd me, got nothing back. She had less protection than I did, and she said something anyway. That's a different kind of courage than what I had. I had a patent and a contract. She had a job she could lose and a conscience she couldn't quiet. The world doesn't hand people like that nearly enough credit. There's something about the relationship between what you build and what you owe it. I spent 19 years building the Meridian framework, not for money, not for recognition, but because the problem was genuinely interesting and because I cared about whether the thing worked. That care is what made it worth protecting. You can't fake that kind of investment, and you can't replace it with a slide deck from a consultant who's never seen a live compliance failure. Walter knew that. That's why he structured the agreement the way he did. He understood that what a person builds with sustained effort and genuine attention is not interchangeable with what someone else buys or inherits. The 48 hours taught me something I didn't expect, that patience and preparation are indistinguishable from strength when they're real. I didn't win that conference room by being louder or angrier or by threatening anything in the moment. I won it 11 months earlier, quietly, in a home office, reading a licensing agreement at 10 p.m. while my wife was in the other room. The moment in the boardroom was just the surface. Everything underneath it had been built long before. If I had one thing to say to someone sitting where I was sitting 5 years ago, good at what they do, starting to feel invisible, watching someone with less skill and more access take up more space, it would be this. The work is the record. Keep it. Protect it. The way you'd protect anything you actually made with your hands, not out of paranoia, out of respect for what it cost you to build it. And if someone ever tells you that what you built is dated, ask them, calmly, if they've read the agreement. Then let the clock run.